peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bombe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and cookbook author, and my fourth book is coming out this fall. Each Saturday, I'm hanging out with the sweetest bakers around and taking a deep dive into their signature bakes. My guest today is Lucie Franc de Ferriere, the founder and baker of From Lucie Bakery in New York City. The East Village spot opened in January 2023 and quickly became a top destination for cake lovers. Lucie's elegant layer cakes topped with fresh flowers can be seen all over Instagram and found at some of the coolest events in town. Today, Lucie and I chat about how her upbringing in the French countryside gave her a lifelong love of nature and appreciation for flavor. Then, we dive into her recipe for chamomile cake with strawberry jam and vanilla bean whipped cream. I loved hearing about Lucie's vision for her beautiful bakery, her 2 weddings — she baked her own cake for one of them, by the way — and her tips for working with fresh flowers. Stay tuned for our chat. Thank you to Grappa Nonnino for supporting today's show. Grappa is a traditional Italian spirit made by distilling pomace, the skin, seeds, and stems of grapes left over from the winemaking process. Generations have loved to sip grappa or use it in cocktails, and some even use grappa as an ingredient in baked goods and desserts. I've used bourbon, rum, and amaretto before, but never grappa. So the folks at Grappa Nonnino challenged me to create some special treats with their award-winning grappa varietals. I made a chocolate budino with Nonnino's Monovitigno Chardonnay grappa. The varietal's notes of bread, vanilla, and pastry paired so well with the chocolate. Nonnino's Monovitigno Merlot grappa, with its notes of rose petal and cherry and its fruity finish, was the perfect addition to my ricotta cake with strawberries. A trifle is always a showstopper, so I made a raspberry trifle but swapped out the traditional sherry for Grappa Nonnino Monovitigno Moscato. This varietal's floral, sage, thyme, and vanilla flavors were an ideal complement to the tart raspberries and sweet mascarpone cream. Nonnino has been distilling grappa since 1897 and has been led by generations of amazing women, from Silvia Nonnino, Italy's first female master distiller, to Silvia's 3 granddaughters, who run the distillery today. Keep an eye on my Instagram, Jessie Sheehan Bakes, to learn and see just how I use Grappa Nonnino in my baked goods and desserts and to get the recipes. You can also learn more about Grappa Nonnino at grappannonnino.it. Peeps, have you heard the news? Cherry Bombe's first ever Jubilee Wine Country is happening in Napa Valley on October 26th and 27th. It'll be a weekend filled with great wine, winemakers, beautiful food, seasonal produce, conversation, connection, and California. Passes are now available. To learn more and snag a pass, visit cherrybombe.com. Let's check in with today's guest. Lucie! So happy to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to chat chamomile cake with you and so much more.
Thank you for having me.
I always love to ask guests about sort of an early sweets or baking memory, and yours are perhaps the most enviable and romantic of the lot. So can you tell us about helping your mom, who was a baking enthusiast herself, in your childhood French countryside kitchen near Bordeaux, located on a vineyard no less? Can you tell us about helping her make cake for guests at her B&B?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably some of my best memories, so I'd love to talk about it. I definitely learned everything from baking from my mother, and like a lot of other people, you just spend all your time in the kitchen watching my mum do things. And I think for a long time, my mum didn't let me do anything. She was just like, you sit next to me and you watch me and you learn. And I was like, okay, that's a different way of teaching, because usually mothers, and I'll probably become like that, I actually would want my kids to get involved and probably do the things that I don't want to do. But my mum was like, no, I want to do everything from A to Z, which I tend to do nowadays too. I think growing up on a farm where my mother had a bed and breakfast, so we'd have a lot of people from all over the world coming, it kind of forced her also to always have the best dinners, the best desserts going on. So in a certain sense, every other day would have a new dessert, we'll have a new jam coming out. Because some people would stay for almost for a week, for 2 weeks. They wouldn't want to have the same dinner every day, so you have to get creative. So I feel like I learned a lot from her on all those recipes, but also on the whole, what people actually want from a cake as well and from a dessert.
I love that. You also said that she taught you like some cake tricks when you were little, like about how to achieve the softest cake or the tastiest cake. Do you remember, or can you share any of her little tricks?
It's more like a technique and I can almost say like a lifestyle. In my mum, it's very easygoing, especially when baking is supposed to be very like to the teaspoon, if I can say. She's more, put this and add that, and almost like a cooking kind of sensation to her baking. And I feel like I took a lot of that in me, and I don't take myself too seriously. So it's more in that sense of what she has in her pantry. She doesn't need to like stop doing everything she's doing to go to the grocery store to kind of follow a recipe to the T. She just makes it up. And I feel like I kind of brought that philosophy in my baking as well.
And so your mom is from New Zealand, and she spoke English to you at home. And her baking style was more English or New Zealand style or Australian style than French. I know that you love Victoria sponge cakes. I've read it's your fave. Did her background and where she came from culturally sort of influence how you bake today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, actually, that I'm still asking myself, because a lot of people associate me as like French baking because I'm French. But I grew up with a Kiwi mother who is very influenced by the Kiwi baking that, New Zealand was also colonized by England, so they're kind of intertwined in that sense. But what's interesting is if you dig deep into the New Zealand baking, there's so many different biscuits that you've never heard of cakes that you've never heard of, or, some even that you've heard of, and I grew up with them, but then my mum kind of did her own spin with the more sort of classic British sort of scones and, cakes with just like whipped cream or heavy cream or just a crème fraîche on top. That's just a bit less sweet in that sense. But it feels very homemade and very, everything's oozing out. So in that sense, I was definitely influenced by that sort of relaxedness and like home baking. So the funny thing about Victoria sponge, it's a long conversation I've had with my mum recently, because I always call it Victoria sponge, and then people are like, well, it's not a classic Victoria sponge. It's a big debate, the Victoria sponge. It's the most classic desserts, and you don't want to do anything different. The New Zealand that I call a Victoria sponge that my mum would make growing up was not a classic Victoria sponge. It's just called a sponge cake. And it's the most classic cake in New Zealand.
Can you tell us how it differs?
I believe it's in the denseness of the cake. The New Zealand sponge cake is closer, I'd say, in that sort of Japanese cake that are a bit more fluffy and airy. You just whip the egg whites for way longer. Whereas the Victoria sponge is a bit more of a denser cake with a lot of like cream in it. So in that sense, they differ. So I grew up with the New Zealand sponge cake that I believe was a Victoria sponge cake until I moved to England, tried the Victoria sponge cake. I was like, something's wrong with that bakery's sponge cake. And they were like, no. My mum was like, no, it's just a different sponge cake. And then I moved to New York, and then you have the vanilla cake too, which is a different type of cake. So it's just interesting to see all those different sort of sponge cakes. I used to call Victoria sponge cake all the time.
I love that. Even the cake we're going to talk about today is not a Victoria sponge, but it's that vibe because it ends up being filled with whipped cream and fruit. And
even in the sponge itself, you'll see it's kind of like a mix of the Victoria sponge, the New Zealand one, the Japanese one, that sort of...
To make it your own, yeah, because you whip those eggs for so long. Yes. So as you've said, you sort of started making cakes professionally almost by accident. You were living in New York City. You were working as a gallerist in March of 2020. The world shut down. You couldn't literally go home to France, so you did figuratively by making cakes that reminded you of your home and making them for your now husband's coffee shop, for pop-ups, in your home kitchen. But they weren't necessarily French cakes. Can you describe the cakes that you were making and the vibe that you would say those cakes had?
Yeah. I think it's hard to, and that's kind of something I like. I don't like to not put them in a category either, because there is that sort of French patisserie that's just very refined and almost kind of has a perfection to it. And the glaze and the making, there's no cream sticking out. Everything's perfect. And even if I wanted to do that, I just couldn't. So I was like, this is not for me. But at the same time, like we were saying earlier, I didn't grow up with that. I grew up with more the kind of luscious cakes. So I'd say my cakes are kind of a good intertwine between I'd say the flavor and taste of French pastry that's not as sweet as what you would usually see in a regular sort of cream cake, but with that sort of lushness of probably a more American style or New Zealand English style of cakes.
Was it almost like an idea for a style came to you, or was it more like you started to make the cakes and it just sort of flowed out of you?
I think it just kind of flowed out of me in the sense of I started with base recipes from my mother, so I stole her initial recipes. Thank you, Mum. And then I just really kind of came up with the flavors that inspired me. I think I was also missing my countryside at the same time, and the garden, the vegetable garden, the herbs that we had over there. So I really kind of wanted to pay tribute to that. It's interesting how you usually see, for example, in perfumes, you see so many sort of notes that go well together and you'll never see it in pastries. And I was like, why not kind of try and work with that as well in mine and have something that's less sweet but more flavorful and interesting in the mouth as well. And I think that just comes back to growing up where you'd have this canteen at school where they would force you at a very young age to finish every single dish that you have at school. And you'd start with a starter, main, cheese, salad, dessert. And the starter would usually be like steamed beetroot. And I hate beets. And they gave me more because they're like, we know you hate it, but you're going to learn how to like it. And so then you have oysters. You'd have a little bit of like pate when it was Christmas time. And so they'd force you to try so many different, interesting, diverse flavors so your palate could adjust when you're a kid, that then I feel like it kind of helped to not just interested in sweetness or in very salty food. It just like that sort of in between, and that it kind of piqued my curiosity and, you know, where can you, like in rosemary and in basil and just in different flavors that you wouldn't usually find in baked goods. That makes sense.
I want to go to school in France. Oh, I
System
want
is
pate.
great for food.
And I don't like beets. I won't. Sorry,
Yeah,
haters.
beets.
But I don't like beets. But I want oysters and pate for lunch
I
at
know.
school.
I mean, when I think about it now, it's like amazing. And they were very strict on what's good and like fries only on Fridays every 2 weeks. And it's, you know, but we were ready for it. We're like, okay.
As for opening the brick and mortar from Lucie, I loved learning that it was Ashley and Gauthier of L'Appartement 4F who actually encouraged you to open a storefront and to do a Kickstarter, and obviously I think they were onto something.
Mm-hmm.
So when From Lucie opened, it was to lines around the block, and you've said that the shop is sort of a love letter to the French countryside. Can you tell us, for those that have never been, tell us a little bit about the menu and a little bit about the vibe of the tiny...
Yeah,
delicious
well, first I want to
shop.
thank Ashley for forcing me for that, because it definitely helped. The inspiration for the bakery in itself was definitely the French countryside, the southwest of France. I know a lot of people usually kind of go to Paris and other places, or the southeast of France, and there is some inspiration in it with the southeast of France where my grandma was living. And so all the houses you can see more in like Menton, right near the border of Italy, they're all kind of bright in color. And I was like, I kind of want to bring that sort of sunny light to New York as well, especially in winter when everything kind of feels gray. Having that sort of facade that's just bright and yellow I think it just makes it nice for a baker as well. You kind of want to just go in and have it baked good. But otherwise, most of it is inspired by where I grew up in the southwest of France, from the tiles to the big window that you see when you walk in that divides the kitchen to the front. That's inspired by the glass house that we have at home. And then all the artworks are made by my friends. So everything feels very personal. And I was lucky enough to be able to do that because the bakery is so small that I didn't need much to make it what it is. I think if I had a bigger space, I would have had to work with someone else. But I was just able to bring in very personal items. Even when it comes to plates, most of the plates that I have that people eat on are plates that I actually bought in France at the secondhand shop that I love. And I just bring them back in my suitcases and I wrap them in my sweaters so they don't break. So yeah, I just kind of love the idea of people walking in and feeling like they're walking into my home as well. And I like the idea that it's a small bakery and it's not like this huge sort of, and I mean, I couldn't afford it either way, but people can kind of walk in and see us baking in the back because that's just the only kitchen we have. It's just a tiny little tunnel.
This could have been something from a long time ago, so it might not be true anymore, but I've read that you actually have like a hand in every cake order.
So,
is that true? Like all orders, at least if they're not baked by you, they're decorated by you?
Yeah, I try as much as I can, obviously. I have an incredible team that I was able to train since I've started, and incredible managers who's also been able to train some of my teams. So I'm able to oversee when it comes to the decorating of baked goods that go out, you know, the day of for the front. But I'm mainly focused at the moment on obviously doing new recipes seasonally because I want it to keep going all the time. I just don't want to just be sitting on the same recipes all the time. I'm always curious what I'm writing. And any of like the big tiered cakes, I still have a really hard time letting go of. So I'm decorating all of those. I'm going to the market for those. And then I'm just kind of in the kitchen. Anyone's asking me a question and I'm training them still on that.
We'll be right back. Today's episode is presented by California prunes, the best kind of prunes out there. I am a big fan of California prunes for two reasons. They're a great addition to your pantry when it comes to smart snacking and baking. You probably already know that prunes are good for your gut. You might even know that prunes are also good for your bone health. But what you really need to know is that prunes are absolutely delicious in both sweet and savory dishes. But don't just take it from me. Here's what some of the country's top culinary experts have to say. Chef Bronwyn Wyatt of Bayou St. Cake says, prunes have an earthy, winey richness that pairs beautifully with the tart, fresh flavor of berries. Chef Kat Turner from Highly Likely in LA says, they are an incredibly versatile ingredient that strike a great balance between sweet and savory. They are incredibly sensual. Ana Castro from Akamaya in New Orleans says, prunes have a sultriness to them. They are very rich and like velvet. I like to use prune puree in my baked goods to give them great flavor and also to replace some of the sugar, eggs, or fat in the recipe. It's super easy to whip up. Just blend prunes and water together and voila! For recipe ideas and more, be sure to check out the California Prunes website at californiaprunes.org. Happy baking and happy snacking. Guess what the latest issue of Cherry Bombe magazine is all about? Paris. Whether you're headed to Paris this year, dreaming of Paris, or just a Francophile at heart, you're going to love this issue. Get recommendations from She's My Cherry Pie faves like Dory Greenspan and Zoe Bakes, meet the coolest Parisians around, and learn about their restaurants, shops, bars, and bakeries, and meet some fascinating expats who changed their lives when they moved to the City of Light. Pick up an issue at cherrybomb.com or your favorite local bookstore, magazine shop, or gourmet store. Places like Beverly Hills Newsstand in LA, Bellport General in Bellport, New York, and Soho News International in Manhattan. You can find a complete list of retailers at cherrybomb.com. And there's a special promo for the Bombe Squad running right now. Buy the Paris issue plus any Cherry Bombe subscription and get free shipping. Just add code PARIS at checkout. Now back to our guest. I was lucky enough to interview you for Cherry Bombe's Cooks and Books a couple of years ago before From Lucie opened. You already said, like my dessert style, I'm influenced by the French countryside, by my upbringing. You wanted your cakes to feel homemade, et cetera, et cetera. Would you say, since opening From Lucie, would you say that shifted at all? Or would you say it sort of stayed consistent since you started? Like that is your vision in your head, and that's what ends up on the plate?
Yeah, I mean, it was an incredible panel, by the way. I loved that one. I thought it was very interesting, and it was great to kind of talk with everyone and get everyone's inspirations. I am forever changing as well, and my environment is changing. So the inspiration is still there, and I feel like it's important in anything we do to always have a bit of a guideline, especially when you feel like you're just kind of, I've worked so hard on this that I still want to keep going and I want to create new things, but it's important for me to remember where I started and what was the meaningful side to it when I first started. So I think having that little guideline helps me to always stay on some sort of a general path. But I like to also welcome new things, new inspirations from where I go. So I'm not limited to that, but there is that sort of French guideline that I like to keep for sure.
I also read, which I loved, there's a common pattern or thread in your aesthetic, which is wildness.
Yes.
Can you unpack, when you think wild, what you're imagining?
Yeah, I feel like wild, another word for it would also be whimsical in a certain sense. When I think of wild, I just think of, those sort of gardens. You think of Secret, the movie The Secret Garden? I don't know why I love this movie. I grew up watching it, but it's just kind of this wild garden. You just open the door and no one has seen it in like 20 years. And I kind of want my cakes to feel that way, where it's a garden that's been overgrown and using a lot of greenery. I like to do that as well. Like I use a lot of flowers, a lot of roses, but I like to just fill it with a lot of greenery as well. So it just feels very wild and feels like you can walk into a garden or a forest that no one has set foot in 10 years, really.
When I was little, The Secret Garden was my favorite book. And in fact, I named my childhood dog Dickon wasn't he like the little boy in the garden? So I literally like The Secret. I can't believe you just said Secret Garden.
It's such an inspiration.
It is. So you have had the opportunity to make some cakes for some pretty fancy peeps like Lord and Anna Sophia Robb and Harry Styles. Is that like so stressful? Are you like losing your mind when you're making a cake for someone like that? Or are you just used to it?
No, I think the only person I'm excited every time. It's a lot of fun. And honestly, what's the most exciting, they've always been very open to me doing whatever I want. And most of them are based on the album. So I just have a picture of the album, and then it's so different from a cake that I'm able to just kind of take colors and also the sort of the vibe from the album as well. So if it's a little quirky, I know my cake's going to be a little bit quirky. I have fun with that, and it's all in my brain. Like, no one else is kind of telling me what to do, so I get to be very creative with it. The only person I got really kind of like, ooh, about was Lord, just because she's from New Zealand. I don't know if I ever told you that, but it's the only album that I had in my little car. And so any sort of like breakups that I have, or going out to a party or going to school, I would just have that in my car. I didn't have any service in my countryside, so the only CD I could listen to was her album, so I just know it by heart. So it was kind of fun to make her cake and then just be able to meet her in person as well. The most fun one that I did recently actually was for Blake Lively for the new movie that's coming out, It Ends With Us. That I did a cake decorating class at her home with her in Vancouver and her and 2 other cast members to just kind of decorate cakes and go, because the movie is kind of based on a florist.
That sounds incredible.
But
I love that.
It's just so nice, and it was like a great moment. It was very simple, and so I just kind of like actually breaking that ice and making something for a human being, you know.
I love that. Can you tell us anything about your new cookbook? I just saw on Instagram you were recently in France doing some of the lifestyle shoots. Can you tell us?
Yeah, of
Is
course.
it okay to chat about that?
Of course, I'm very excited about it. Yes, I recently just signed this cookbook deal, and I'm very, very excited because I never thought I could write a cookbook. And I think if you spoke to my incredible agent who found me, she would probably say, you know, I'm very, very unorganized. But I guess that's the way I make my cakes.
Wildness,
wildness.
whimsical.
It goes all the way to my blood. It's just fascinating because it's a whole different world that I just didn't know, and I still don't really know how to tackle, but I love the process of it. It's a longer process than I thought it was because it takes years to create a cookbook, but it's one where I just get to be very creative again and work with incredible people. I have this incredible co-writer, Lauren, who's very, very patient, and I love her to pieces. And then I'm able to work with Lucie, who I've worked with in the past, who's this incredible young photographer who came all the way to France and shot for 7 days at my home with no assistant. No, it was just us two just kind of making it happen. And she works mainly on film camera too. So it was, you know, a lot of patience, and it was very intimate. So I hope people will feel it in the cookbook when they see it.
I love that. So you had 2 incredible weddings, one in France and one in New York, to honor both your and your husband's different cultures. I just wondered if you would tell us a little bit about your 2 wedding cakes. First, for your Long Island wedding with your husband's family, your mom and you made the cake in your Airbnb kitchen the night before the wedding for 400 people.
Crazy.
It was a 4-tier raspberry yogurt cake with basil, Swiss meringue buttercream, and raspberry jam. And you decorated it with orange and yellow flowers. So I wanted to know about the choice of the color of flowers because I know there was a reason. And also, was that like so stressful?
It was probably the worst idea I've ever had. Just a piece of advice, don't do that. It was a good challenge, but especially because the wedding was a 4-day-long wedding and the cake was on the last day or last evening. And so I was exhausted by then. And I thought, it'll be fine. I have the whole morning, afternoon, but then you have to get ready as well. And you know, you're just tired, and my mom was tired, and we were like, why are we doing this in the kitchen? But at the same time, it was a good moment, and we had a lot of fun. So I'll always cherish that. But don't do it.
And tell us about the orange and yellow flowers.
I was asking Gurpreet as well. I was just kind of like, what are the colors in general? And on the Friday night, we decided to go with kind of this big...
Tell us a little bit about his heritage, just so people know.
Yeah, of course. My husband is originally Sikh. His parents are both Sikh, and so he grew up in Queens. After he moved to Long Island, and so his parents are very religious in that sense, and I think it was very important to respect that religion and also the culture by having this wedding. And then my dad is also very religious, he's Protestant, and we also have quite a strong culture, so we were like, this is going to be a tough one to just put together because his parents are vegetarian and also don't drink alcohol, and my dad is a winemaker and has over 70 cows now, meat cows, so we were just like, this is not going to work out. And so we were very smart at doing 2 different weddings. We loved it because we're able to really embrace and go to the, you know,
extreme.
To the extreme exactly of what the traditions are as well. So I had a lot of fun being able to just kind of be part of this wedding and also let his family shine and do their thing. I just happened to be the bride, you know.
And are those orange and yellow colors traditional for...
Exactly, traditional. I mean, they're traditional, I believe, in India in general as well, but a lot of Sikh weddings, you see them kind of like in drapes as well, like marigolds. I couldn't find marigolds, to be honest. So I was just like, I'm just going to go with the color palette. And again, I didn't take myself too seriously. And I thought that would be kind of fun. And they were all a little quirky, mainly because they were 4 days old, because I had to leave the city 4 days later. But I thought it kind of played with it.
And then for your French wedding, you did not make your own cake, thank goodness. Nope. Your favorite local bakery made a giant pièce montée, which translates sort of loosely as mounted or assembled piece. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that it is similar-ish to like a croquembouche, but I also heard you say that that's not even a word necessarily that people would ever use in France to describe this dessert. But I also read that sometimes a pièce montée, which is a traditional wedding cake, is not even eaten.
Interesting.
Yeah, strange, right? But that's not the case.
No,
Yours
usually
was edible and has like these classic wedding dessert flavors of like salted chocolate praline and espresso coffee and lavender. Oh my gosh. Tell us. Was it pointy and tall?
It was
like a croquembouche?
Very tall, very pointy, very large. And it was honestly the best idea I've ever had. I loved doing the tasting. And this baker, Cassian, is incredible. He's known mainly for his chocolates, but also for his pièce montée. And I don't know if you would try to make a pièce montée for someone else. I think it's the most stressful thing, especially if it's a wedding that's in August, which mine was in August, and it's the south of France and it's boiling hot. You're making a caramel to hold the piece up. You can't deliver at 6 p.m. if someone's eating it and taking it out at 10 p.m. because in French weddings, you eat your dessert at midnight, which we did. And so the kind lady from the bakery delivered the cake at 10:30 p.m. at night. And what happened, the interesting story, is it's this huge pièce montée, and she came on her own, and she opened the trunk of the car, and my brother was there to receive it, and she was crying. And my brother was like, what is going on? What happened? And there was this tiny little shoe that fell off of the pièce montée, so there's a little hole. And she's like, I'm so sorry, this has never happened. 20 years of business. My brother gave her a hug. He was like, can you not just put it back? And so they just put it back in their hole. She's like, yeah, no, but it's not professional. And he just gave her the biggest hug. He's like, oh my God, you're amazing. This is absolutely amazing. You're totally fine. And so it was a very incredible, just plain. I was like, I actually don't want any flowers on this one. I just want it to be the most classical pièce montée I've ever seen. And then the flavors can be more interesting. And I like the traditional praline, obviously. That's more I think it's more of a French flavor now that I think about it. And then there was like an espresso flavor, a dark salted chocolate, and then the lavender. I was like, that's a good note to my lemon lavender cake. And the funny story is we got married at the end of the park. Like the dinner was at the very end of the park, and it's quite a long walk from my home. So 2 people had to hold it all the way down to the park, which was pretty scary. And I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in France, you have a lot of weddings where they put those fireworks on cakes. And so my friend who was in charge of just making sure everything goes smoothly was like, yeah, it's a great idea, put fireworks. I was like, and I asked previously, but someone else said no fireworks. And so I kind of see the cake coming down and I see the fireworks. I'm like, please, no. And she's like, oh my God, turn around, take them off. So I see them going back up with them. It was the funniest thing. And then the nicest part is that usually you sit down and have dessert, but it was midnight and everyone's like, we want to dance. People dance until 8 a.m., which is absolutely crazy and I love it. But no one wanted to go back and sit down for the shoes. So then what we did is we just put it back up in the kitchen and just dismantle it and bought a huge tray on the dance floor. And you have pictures of Gurpreet just holding the tray around and everyone's stuffing their face with choux because it's such a great, easy thing to put in your mouth while you're dancing.
So it's almost like it's tons of little profiteroles.
Exactly.
Filled with a flavored cream, essentially, right? And you were using lots of different flavored creams.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Which I do at the bakery now as well. I make this little choux that I sell by the little piece. And traditionally they come in like a cream, like a custard cream a little bit in the middle, but it's not that I don't like that. It's a little heavier. So I started making them with infused whipped creams, which are a little bit more
so
fun,
flavorful.
Or like mousse, chocolate mousse in it.
The recipe we're going to talk about is your chamomile cake with strawberry jam and vanilla bean whipped cream. So first things first, we're going to make the cake. We're going to heat the oven to 300 degrees. And is that convection?
I believe so.
So it would probably be 325 in a regular oven, which is a little low for a cake. Often it's 350.
Yeah.
But
I usually do all my cakes at 350. It's just the color tends to get a little uneven if I do it at 350. So 325 is the right one. And 300 is what I use at the bakery with the big oven.
So first we're going to infuse some milk. It's whole milk, I assume?
Yes.
So we're going to infuse whole milk with loose leaf chamomile tea leaves. Mm-hmm. Is there a brand of tea that you...
Not specifically. I actually change it quite a bit, depending on what I find.
Ideally, infuse overnight in the refrigerator, but if you can't do that, if you're in a rush, at least 30 minutes on the counter. So if you're doing a short amount of time, you kind of want a room temp infusion, and if you have longer, you put it in the fridge.
I would still say if you're like boiling your milk, you're infusing, still let it sit for like 15 minutes uncovered, room temp, and then put it in the fridge. Don't put it straight from boiling to the fridge because that might cut the whole process.
If we have the time, is it always better to do the longer infusion?
Yeah. I think so. I actually currently have a rose milk infusion in my fridge since yesterday. So when I come home, I'm going to do another rose cake.
And you have a great tip about infusions, I think, in general, which is that because the leaves are going to absorb a lot of the milk, after you've strained the leaves from the infused milk, you're going to have to add a little bit of regular milk just to make sure you have the right amount of liquid.
To even it back up, yeah.
Now we're going to sift some all-purpose flour, baking powder, and kosher salt, and set that aside. And then in a stand mixer fitted with a whisk attachment, we're going to whisk the eggs for about 30 seconds just to kind of break them up, I assume.
And room temp eggs.
Room temperature eggs.
Very important.
Because that will help everything emulsify, yes?
And it will fluff up the cake way.
And we're going to whisk the eggs for about 30 seconds, kind of like on medium to medium-high speed.
Medium speed is fine.
Perfect. Then we're going to slowly pour in granulated sugar. Then we're going to whisk for about 7 minutes on very high speed until the mixture triples in volume.
Exactly.
And this is where I asked, this is sort of a technique that's often used in a sponge cake, and you're using it here sort of for that same lift. And it's funny, before we chatted, I wrote, does this type of cake have a name? But now I know its name is Lucy. And it's like the Lucy Victorian sponge.
And the Japanese sponge,
exactly.
So kind of like that airy.
That. Meanwhile, while that's all mixing together for 7 minutes, we'll put our chamomile-infused milk and some cubed butter in a saucepan. And I wonder, do you have a particular brand of pan or saucepan that you guys like? Are they just sort of heavy-bottomed?
Yeah, just heavy-bottomed ones, actually, so they don't fall.
And then we're going to cook sort of over medium heat at this point till the milk is foamy and the butter's melted.
You don't want the milk bubbling, though. Yeah, just a slight
foam, right.
Exactly.
Just almost like a simmer.
Exactly.
And then we're going to strain to remove those tea leaves. We might add a little bit of extra milk if we've lost some. And I noticed that the recipe doesn't call for vanilla. Is that because of the tea? You don't want the two flavors to fight?
The chamomile is so subtle that you don't want to be cutting it with vanilla.
Because sometimes I find in recipes, like if I make a lemon cake, I add vanilla because I think it helps pop the lemon. But lemon's already a strong flavor. And I can imagine chamomile, it will just overpower it.
Chamomile will overpower it. And a little bit of salt just, I feel like, brings it out a bit more even.
Perfect. Once our eggs have tripled, we'll add our flour mixture in 3 batches on low speed, now with our paddle attachment. And now we're going to add a little bit of canola oil. I'm going to ask why, but I think I know the answer. Is that for moisture?
Yeah. It just keeps moisture and it keeps your cake good up to 4 days almost with that. And it actually helps a little bit with the fluffiness. So
yeah. I was going to say that I love an oil-based cake. First of all, I love them because they're easy. You don't have to cream butter or room temperature butter, etc. But I also love them because an oil-based cake can sit on your counter and still be moist because at room temperature, oil is still liquid.
And they're pretty spongy, the oil-based cakes. So it adds that sort of sponginess, even though it's not a lot, but it kind of helps as well. I don't know. I've tried it without and with, and I prefer it with,
So we're going to add that canola oil to that butter and milk mixture, and we're just going to add about 1/5 of that egg and flour mixture to the oil, butter, and milk, and just fold together gently. And is that just so that you don't deflate all of the lift that you have in that batter?
And you pre-prepare it a little bit to kind of go into the big mixture after.
And now we'll fold gently, and I assume by hand at this point, with a spatula. Do you have a favorite kind of, or do you use those restaurant supply ones that have red handles? And
the spatula actually I use is Great Jones spatulas.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Oh, I love Great Jones.
There's a lot of Great Jones products.
I love Great Jones. So now we're going to mix by hand with our Great Jones spatula. And then with the mixer on low, we'll add the oil and butter mixture back in just until combined, like just maybe you see that last streak of flour and you're done.
You just want to not see the flour, but you want to keep the airiness in it. So you don't want to overfold it either, you know.
And now we're going to prep our pans, or maybe we prepped them in the beginning. For cake pans, what brand of cake pan are you using?
I buy them on Whipstraw. But it's always been very resistant. I still have the same one since I've opened, so I recommend those.
And typically, are they 8-inch or 9-inch pans for
8-inch.
8-inch.
I like the 8-inch. Is that a team thing? I feel like some people are team 9-inch and some people are team 8-inch.
I feel like standard is 8 to me. Okay. And I feel like when people make 9-inch cakes, they only do 2 layers. When people make 8-inch cakes, they tend to do 3. I often wonder about that too. I tend to write recipes calling for 8 because I feel like it's more standard than 9.
Right. Because my mom only makes 9-inch cakes. So then I'm like, oh, I wonder if it's like a...
I feel like in America, I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like it's an 8-inch thing. Do you grease with butter or with oil or with spray?
I do it with the spray oil at the bakery. It's easier on the edges. And then I still put some parchment paper at the bottom. I used to cut it in a circle, and now I've recently found out that you can actually buy some pre-cut circled ones. Lifesaver.
So easy.
So I still put that at the bottom because it helps in case the cakes.
I knew they existed, but I never bought them. But the pre-cut parchment that fits in the half-sheet pan.
I know.
Oh, my gosh.
Life-changing too, right?
Heaven. Heaven. I highly recommend, peeps. Now we're going to bake. How long do we bake them for?
So it depends on your oven again. That's kind of an important one, especially now that I'm baking it in the kitchen oven at the bakery. It's quite a different oven, but I would say usually 30 minutes and rotating it after 15 minutes so you get that goldness on both sides.
I'm a big rotator. It's interesting, maybe because I was trained in a bakery, but a lot of people don't rotate. And I just think there is no perfect oven that can make a perfect cake without rotating. But you
also have the technique of rotating very quick before the cake plates.
Yes. And then I assume we let it cool because we don't want to fill these before we... So do you usually pop them out of the pan after 10 minutes?
I usually leave them in the pan for like almost 20 to 30 minutes so they really cool down, especially when it's a butter-based cake. I don't like to take them out too early because then I feel like they just dry out on the outside and become very crunchy. So I kind of want to leave them until they're cooled and then take them out, let them cool for another 20 minutes on just a rack to make sure that the moistness doesn't, just come on board straight away. And then I can start, once they're completely cool, I can start adding all the goodies on top.
Now we're going to make the strawberry jam, although I imagine you could make this ahead of time.
Correct.
You could make the day ahead or whenever you want.
Months ahead if you know how to seal jams.
So we're going to place strawberries and granulated sugar in a pot, and I imagine it's sort of the same thing we did in the cake recipe. We want something with a heavy bottom.
Correct.
Over medium-high heat, and we're going to be skimming off sort of the light pink foam as it sort of rises to the top, stirring continuously so we don't burn our jam. And then you write when the middle of the jam thickens, that's when we'll kind of test our jam. Is that because the edges may stay a little bit looser, so you want to look to the middle of the jam to know when it's set?
Yeah, I feel like the middle just has all of that texture. And then the sides, I usually always scrape the sides because, they always stick to the sides as well. So those are always a little looser. And then kind of when you put your spatula in the middle, if it feels a little bit more resistant, a bit thicker, almost kind of like, that jelly sort of texture. I mean, obviously jam and the kind of jam that I make gets even thicker later on by letting it set. So it won't get that very thick consistency that you can see when you're buying a store-bought jam at the end. But you still feel a bit more resistance and it's not as runny as it was.
And I just realized, so you're not putting anything in the jam to help thicken it. The thickening is just coming from the cooking and the breaking down of the fruit. And is that the same for every fruit jam you make, or do you have to add something?
So, like you're talking about gelatin, right?
Yes, something like that. Or pectin, people put in?
I don't know why. I just don't want to work with that. Yeah. And I try to do anything to not work with it and find different solutions. So, no, so far I've never actually used it in my cakes or in jams, though.
So we're going to take a spoonful of the jam and put it on a cold plate. And when you say cold plate, are you literally chilling the plate in the refrigerator, or you just mean a plate in your kitchen that's not warm?
So I didn't used to do that. That's Katie, the bakery manager technique that she brought with her, and I think it's absolutely amazing. She puts it in the freezer. She puts like a small little plate in the freezer for a little bit, and then she brings it out. And ideally, it can be a cold spoon, but just kind of a middle spoon. You put
a cereal, like something you'd eat your cereal with?
Yeah. And even you can be a teaspoon if you want, but ideally just like a cereal spoon. And then you put the jam on the plate, and then you tip the plate, and then see if it drips a lot or not, if it stays, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And it's kind of more of a visual thing. And
yes,
I'm actually hoping to put it in the cookbook so people can see it visually.
Yes.
The drip.
Oh, I love that. And if it stays, you're done.
Exactly.
Is a little bit of a drip okay, or do you really?
Exactly. A little bit of a drip is fine, but if it's like running off the plate, then you know it's not there yet.
Oh, I love that.
And honestly, even just the back of a spoon, I know that's a bit more of a classic one, but if the back of a spoon is a bit more opaque from it, then you know if it just gets really runny and see-through, then you know you still have a little bit to go.
Yeah, you're dragging the back of the spoon through the jam to see if it's set, and if it sort of sticks there to the back of the spoon, you're good to go. I love that.
It's a homemade technique.
Yeah. No, but it's so good. Are there different levels of a set jam? Like, do you have some applications where you want it looser, or do you sort of cook all of your... Because I know jam is sort of it's a Lucie thing. No matter the berry or no matter the fruit, you're looking for the same consistency.
I would say yes and no. It actually depends. Sometimes, unfortunately, it happened without wanting it. It became a bit more firm, and then you just know that you can actually use that for a certain type of cake as well as you're making. Because sometimes if you have a jam that's a little bit more runny, that looks nice, for example, on a Victoria sponge, and you want that runniness, you don't particularly want it in a wedding cake where you want it to really stay inside the cake, even though you do those borders. The buttercreams, I feel like having one that's a little bit more, I wouldn't say sticky, but you know what I mean? Like a bit more of a structure. Yeah,
firm.
A bit more firm is a good one. But I feel like when I do, for example, the pear ginger jam, you want a bit more of a firm one too as well. I like to still have really bits of pears in it. So that one I would say has a bit more firmness, and the raspberry or the strawberry jam will be a little bit more runny. If that makes sense.
So once the jam is set, we'll add a pinch of salt for flavor and then a small squeeze of lemon for brightness and pull it off the heat and just let it come to room temperature. Or even do you want it cold before you're going to work with it?
Yeah, cold is ideal.
Now we're going to make our vanilla bean whipped cream. So we're going to pour cold heavy cream in our stand mixer bowl with some sifted powdered sugar and some vanilla bean paste. Is there a brand of vanilla that you guys like?
Yes.
Nielsen Massey or
no,
Hey
it's
Lala?
this incredible woman from New Zealand, actually, who I met recently.
Is it Hey Lala?
Yes,
no? Yeah.
It's Hey Lala.
Yeah, I met her recently. I met her at Jubilee.
Oh, she's incredible. She came to the bakery once, and her farm is in Tonga, which is right outside of New Zealand. And we were just talking about how, my whole family's from New Zealand. And then I spoke to my aunt who lives in New Zealand. She actually worked in Tonga for many years, and I believe on the same sort of farm situation. So she knew her, and I was like, wow, this is such a small world. So we've been using some of her vanillas, mainly the vanilla bean paste, because it's just so good.
And then we're going to whisk the cream in the stand mixer. And you say until just starting to curdle, but do you mean almost like stiff peaks?
Exactly. Stiff peaks, but you're past the stiff peaks.
Ooh.
So it is, I love using words like that sound like, it shouldn't be like that, but it actually should be like that.
Yeah.
It's the same with my Swiss meringue buttercream where I'm like, I like it airy, bubbly, which is not supposed to be that way, but I like those situations where it's a little bit in between. And I feel like the curdled, it's not actually curdled, but it's past the stiff peak. So a touch curdled where it actually will stay firm longer.
Yeah.
I just love it.
Yeah, no, I can picture that absolutely perfectly. It's not gross at all in a curdled way, but you can this is going to turn people off, but it's not this. It almost looks a teeny bit lumpy, or
exactly.
It has a funny texture where you've gone, I love that that's a choice.
I know.
And I love that.
And the vanilla bean just kind of adds a little touch to it.
So now to assemble, we'll take one layer of the cake, and I assume we'll place it, maybe we don't. We don't place it upside down. Do we cut off the top?
Yeah, usually this one doesn't dome too much, and I think the oil is part of that reason. It doesn't dome as much, but I used to flip it, but I decided not to anymore for this one, and I do like to cut the top layer of the bottom layer, if that makes sense, if you're doing a 2-layer one, just because then the cream and the jam grip a bit better on the cake, because you'll see that your dome is a little bit more smooth, exactly. And so I feel like having that actual sponge of the cake and also the jam, and I'm that kind of team where I like the jam to really ooze in the sponge of the cake. I know a lot of people like to put the buttercream first and then the jam on top so it doesn't sponge in, but I like when it sponges in.
So you'll put the jam first and then the whipped cream on top? And then the second layer on top?
Exactly.
I love. And then just powdered
dusting
sugar.
Powdered, yeah.
Oh my gosh. I wondered if you had any slicing tricks, because I feel like when you slice and you press down, everything squirts out the sides. Do you use a serrated knife or do you saw gently?
I feel like that's part of the
joy.
Fun of it. I think everyone should experience that, because having the jam and the cream oozing out everywhere, then you have to like it. It's like a whole experience. But if you are trying to be a bit more formal and impress people, I would say the classic hot water knife. You have boiling water, and then just kind of have a good sharp knife that's not serrated. It's just kind of a thin, long knife. I don't go flat, if that makes sense. I point the knife upwards, and then I kind of tippy-toe outwards, and then I go down.
At the end.
Does that make sense? I go down at the end.
Yeah.
And then I like to go out. It's hard to explain if you don't have the video.
I know.
But tippy-toe at the end, and then just take it out without lifting it again. Because if you lift it again, then you'll have the jam, and the jam and the cream will kind of mix.
So it's like go down with the knife and then slide the knife out parallel to the surface.
Exactly. So you still get that nice sort of the cream and then the division between the cream and the jam. Because if you bring it back up, then everything's kind of smudging along. It's not as pretty.
And is this the kind of cake you would serve by the slice in the bakery?
I currently actually have it at the bakery. So.
Oh, I love. So there are obviously no flowers on this cake. Is that hard for you when you have a cake that you can't put a flower on?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's nice to actually take a break from flowers. I like that I actually use, in a certain sense, a flower in the cake and not just on top of the cake. So like the chamomile is kind of, I can call that a flower, right?
Yes, of course.
I grew up having that in the garden and putting in salads as well. So I was like, I just really want to incorporate it in a cake. And once in a while, I have people coming in being like, I just want a good old slice of cake. Can you give me that? I don't need to treat myself to a flower today. I was like, I got you. And I have 2 or 3 cakes that don't have the flowers on top. And the locals usually come back for those as well, which is nice.
I love that. It's funny that you should mention salads because I wanted to talk a teeny bit just about decorating with flowers and your kind of like your signature. And I read that perhaps the inspiration in some ways comes from the fact that your mom taught you to put flowers in your salads.
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, if it can be in a salad, why can't it be in a cake?
And a cake, exactly.
I love that, Lucie.
And also how much flowers do bring flavors to a lot of things. And I think people don't think of that. Usually add salt or pepper to a salad, but I feel like chamomile can bring that sort of herby pepperness to a salad, like a grape, hyacinths, actually, those little small ones that you can add the buds, those bring a lot of like pepperness to a salad and also beautiful color and aesthetic side. But I think just bringing also like a rose on top of a cake, the smell and the scent of it goes with the jam and the cream. It just kind of goes all well together.
And the trick is just nothing is toxic, obviously, but not everything is edible.
Exactly.
So some of the things are purely decorative, but if somebody put it in their mouth, they'd be fine. It's just not necessarily known for its flavor.
Exactly. I only work with pesticide-free and organic flowers. And so most of the flowers I use are actually edible, most of them. If you wanted to, like a rose flower on top, a mum, even a peony is edible. If you take a petal, like I always tell people, just don't eat the whole flower at once. Like a lot of people walk in and they're like, can I eat the whole flower? I'm like, well, you can. Well, good luck with that. Just eat a petal, for example. But for example, on my tiered cakes where I use flowers that aren't edible, they're like toxic in itself. But brides would ask me, they're like, this is my bouquet or this is the flowers I want to have. And so what I use, and I use them even on the bigger 8-inch birthday cakes, is use water pipettes. Those pipettes that florists use as well. And I introduced the actual stem in the water pipette so they don't actually touch the cake. And the stem goes straight into the buttercream and then I just kind of cover it. So at no time is the flower touching the cake and that people have to eat it.
When we spoke a couple of years ago for Cooks and Books, I know you had said that you were, at that point, you were buying sort of short stems at the market that would otherwise be thrown out.
Yep.
Is that still what you're doing? Or I also read maybe now you have a specific florist that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I actually work with many different people and like farmers in itself, but I have a florist in the Lower East Side who I've worked with since the beginning who's helped me source different flowers, and she usually has like a little bundle of flowers at the end of the week, and I just walk by when I go home and she's just like, there you go, just take those.
Aww.
And so it's kind of like a good sort of recycling in a sense, and they're all really nice and fresh. It's just they're way too short for her to put it in a bouquet. So,
and do you have any like just general tips or tricks for working with flowers that you could share with listeners?
I think I could talk about that for days, but I think the basics I really had to learn from scratch, to be honest. A lot of YouTube videos, and then I realized, I bought a lot of books, but then I was like, there's not a lot of books that kind of have the baking and the food and how to work with flowers within food. So I'm still working out how I can introduce that in my cookbook to make it easy for people. But I think just working with flowers that have a stem that are a little bit more firm, then you know that your flower is going to last a little longer. If you're trying not to put that, water pipettes, or just put those flower tapes as well at the end of the stem, so then you don't have that water from the flower oozing out in your cake because you don't want that. But otherwise, just kind of being very kind with flowers and probably buying flowers that are closed when you get them and letting them sit for a day or two, and then you really have like a beautiful open flowers versus buying one that's already very open that you might use in a day and then it won't last a second on the cake. And then just kind of opening them up even yourself with your hands. Like the roses, for example, I like to kind of grab the petals and bend them and then just have a really open rose so it takes more space on the cake, So there's a lot of little tricks like that.
And what about petals versus an entire flower? Is that just sort of what moves you and whether...
Yeah, I mean, I feel like usually the petals I use on cakes is petals that actually fell from the flower. And I'm like, this is just meant to be. And so I just placed them in the little holes that are left on the cake. But most recently, I've actually, when I sell slices at the shop, I kind of like to put petals straight on the cake because then it makes it easier for people to actually have a bite of it without having to like take the flower. But there's two teams. Some people like the whole flower and some people like the petals. So at least they get to pick.
Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Lucie. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was so fun.
That's it for today's show. Thank you to Nonino and California Prunes for supporting this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your baking pals about us. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bombe Podcast Network and is recorded at CityVox Studio in Manhattan. Our producers are Kerry Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Elizabeth Vogt. Our associate producer is Jenna Sadhu, and our content and partnerships manager is Londyn Crenshaw. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!